All right, so we'll slowly get started, and the rest of the attendants will join as we go along. So welcome to this LIEP METHEVAL seminar. We're very happy to welcome today Justin Jagash, who is the director of the CARES Center, which is the Center for Advancement in Realist Evaluation and Synthesis. He's also a visiting professor at the University of West England and a research fellow at the University of Surrey. He has developed an extensive portfolio of realist methodology training workshop and has been involved in a lot of realist evaluations. So, of course, as an interdisciplinary evaluation center at LIEP, we're very interested in realist evaluation. As part of this METHEVAL seminar, we've already had presentations by last year by Anna Manzano on realist interviews, and also by Clémentin on his integration of elements of the realist approach into more experimental methods in education. And today we're very happy to welcome Justin Jagash for a presentation, a broader presentation on understanding realist methodology and the CMO configuration. So I'll give you the floor, Justin, for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a moment for question and answers. So for the public, don't hesitate to send your questions as we go in the chat. Justin mentioned that you can also write your questions in French if you wish, and he will answer in English during the Q&A. So thank you very much. So Justin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks for the invitation to speak. It's a pleasure to be here, and welcome everybody to this short seminar on realist methodology. As Anne mentioned, I'm the director for the Center for Advancement in Realist Evaluation and Synthesis, and I have been a mentor, trainer, consultant in the realist approach for quite some time now. Sort of formally since 2014, but really I started my realist process, my realist journey in 2009 during my postdoctoral fellowship. And so today I'd like to introduce realist methodology to you, and specifically the context mechanism outcome configuration, which is the central heuristic that we use in the realist approach, and to give you a flavor of what realist methodology is and how it can be used. So yes, as Anne said, I'm hoping to wrap up my formal presentation in 40 minutes, and then I will be happy to answer questions or engage in discussion and conversation with you about the approach. So, so for the formal presentation, I will attempt to explain the logic of realist methodology and to situate the realist paradigm within a framework of research paradigms, and to define the main heuristic in the realist approach, which is the CMO configuration, the context mechanism outcome configuration, and to present some examples of the CMO configuration, and finally to provide some concluding thoughts about the approach. So the first question we may ask is, what is realist methodology? And so an easy way to address that question is it's an approach to research that addresses the questions: what works, for whom, under what circumstances, and how. This has become the tagline of the approach. And so if anybody asks you, what is realist methodology, you can say, well, it's a research approach that addresses questions: what works, for whom, under which circumstances, and how, as opposed to the research question, does it work? Now, it here is like the intervention or the program under study, and there are a lot of research examples where the attempt is to assess whether an intervention works. If you have a program, if you have a policy, an intervention, you want to, you know, in some cases, people would like to answer this question: does it work? If it works, then we can proceed with rolling it out, scaling it up, and expect success. That's the idea in this does it work paradigm. But the realists have a different paradigm. The realists will say that interventions will work differently for different people in different time points all the time. So we're not expecting 100% success in our interventions. And in fact, even that may be somewhat problematic. So the realist approach is premised on the assumption that interventions will always work differently for different people, different locations, different time points, and so on. So we are not looking for 100% success. We're looking for explanatory insight into how programs work differently for different people under different circumstances, different contexts, different time points, and so on. So we may develop theories around how the program works generally, but we are also developing theories about how the program, how the intervention under scrutiny, how this intervention may work differently. Okay, so that is the first understanding of realist methodology. So evaluating interventions in the hope for finding 100% success in outcomes. It's not only unrealistic, but even unproductive. This is a realist logic. We're not assuming that 100% success of an intervention is the goal. Because even if evaluation results demonstrate high levels of success, the why and the how questions, why does it work? How does it work? These are still vitally important because implementation contexts are diverse and constantly changing. So changes in context will always mediate outcomes, even of validated interventions. In other words, if you did a study, say you did a randomized controlled trial of an intervention, a complex intervention, and somehow miraculously, it achieved extremely positive results, 90%, 95% success in the achieving the outcomes of interest. So that gives a lot of confidence to the intervention. But the reality is that context always mediates the outcomes of interventions. Context actually also changes interventions. And so if you have a randomized controlled trial with high success, there is no guarantee that that success will sustain when contexts change. And contexts are always changing. The pandemic is an example of drastic change in context, and we can expect context to be changing gradually or suddenly. We have to account for this. So realist methodology accounts for this. Realist methodology is context sensitive. We're trying to understand the context mechanism interaction. Okay. So when we do a realist study, when we analyze data using realist logic, we are looking for generative explanation. Okay, generative explanation is what we're looking for. In other words, asking questions such as how is the intervention meant to work reveals the underpinning generative causal explanation. In other words, the mechanisms. This is where we get to in thinking about mechanisms. We ask these questions. How does the intervention work? Why do we assume it's a good idea to do this? Now, if you try to answer that, well, we assume it's a good idea because, and the answer after that follows that sentence is starting to get to the mechanisms of action, how it works. So generative causal explanation involves mechanisms activating in context. And realist evaluators want to explore this context mechanism interaction. Mechanisms are about the program. The context is about the environment, the backdrop. It might be the social environment, the physical environment, and we are constantly looking for the context mechanism interaction in every instance. So even this question, how is the intervention meant to work? Well, the intervention might have many components. The intervention might have multiple strategies. Even within one strategy, there might be multiple aspects. And so we may develop theories that help us understand interventions and more specifically their components and how each component of an intervention has mechanisms. Each component has a causal contribution generating outcomes through an explanatory force. So in other words, a mechanism. And so this is where we're going with the realist evaluation is we granulate our intervention, the idea around our intervention. We get very specific about the different aspects of the intervention. We develop multiple theories, program level theories, not high theories, but very low to the ground theories that articulate something about the causal impact of that specific component. And then we put that all together, we collect data and we analyze data with all that program theory work done to understand how a program works. So realist analysis can complement counterfactual and constructionist forms of evaluation, but it is different. So counterfactual is like pre-post test design, experiment with a control group, and so on, where you're collecting data on different groups and comparing that data to make a causal claim. That is different. That is not a realist way of understanding causation, but it is a way. And similarly, we have constructivist accounts, which may be qualitative research, ethnography, and so on, that provide rich description of a situation, but may not be focused on the causal mechanisms. Now, it may be, but not always. But the realist approach is always focused on the causal mechanisms. And so I sort of depict this in this slide here, in which we can understand that the realist paradigm is about generative explanation, whereas the positivistic paradigm, say randomized trials, pre-post test design, and so on, is around counterfactual confirmation. You know, control an experiment group, and you compare those facts. It's counterfactual, and then the qualitative work might be around the constructive perspective of interviewees, as well as the perspective of the qualitative analyst providing a viewpoint on a certain reality. It may not be about causation per se, but these paradigms can work together. There are differences and there may be even some incompatibilities, but they also can work together to produce a robust vision of program evaluation. And really what we're trying to do is develop insight. Okay, so we're trying to understand the ability to perceive the deeper reality involved in causal impact. That's the goal. If we can become more insightful about how programs work, this will prevent us from making errors, mistakes, unintended harms, improving the customization of programs, even before we implement, you know. So hindsight is good, because hindsight is that reflection on our success, on our failures, the ability to reflect on causal impact retrospectively. And foresight is very, very important. The ability to envision causal impact prospectively. So we have foresight, we have hindsight, and we have insight. And, you know, what I want to say is that what is the point of doing research if we're not developing insight and foresight through hindsight? Because the better we can get at implementing policies, the more chances there are we are going to be able to reduce and solve wicked problems, complex problems. And there are so many in the world that are not easily solvable. So this is what inspires me about thinking of the realist approach and thinking about its situation and situating it within a larger research field. We want to develop insight. So in our analysis, in a realist analysis, the idea is that in our data, when we're analyzing data, we are searching for causal insight. And that causal insight can then be analyzed in terms of the context, mechanism, outcome, configuration to make sense of the social architecture of programs. And when we have a clearer vision of programs and how they work, how they're meant to work, and the consequences and the unintended outcomes that accrue, we can better customize our programs to the diverse needs of context. Okay. And this is a metaphor, is something that I speak about a lot in terms of understanding realist philosophy. We can look at this metaphor of an iceberg. So in realist philosophy, there's a term called ontological depth, and that's written here, ontological depth. The idea, realists have this idea that reality is stratified in layers and there's depth to our reality. So even in a given moment in time, even in this very moment, there is a surface level view of our reality here. I'm talking, you're listening, there's some technology involved, but there's also a deeper reality. And that deeper reality may be emotional, it might be biophysiological. There are many ways to understand the depth to our reality, but there is certainly a deeper reality, and all of the depth is working all together. Now, the idea around ontological depth is important because it helps us understand mechanisms. What we say in the realist approach is that mechanisms lie in the deeper layers of our reality. So like the iceberg metaphor, you might argue that the mechanisms are in what's under the water. That part of the iceberg that is under the water that you can't see, but is serving to produce the empirical, what is above the water. So when we think of empirical evidence is evidence that is easily measurable, easily describable. And the challenge is understanding the underpinning mechanisms. Those underpinning mechanisms may not be so measurable, they may not be so describable, and that is the challenge. This is what the realist approach brings to the table, is this challenge to take seriously those aspects of our reality which are not easily measurable, not easily describable. Like, for example, the idea of trust, or the idea of respect, or the idea of empathy. When you think, if you have a theory that suggests that patient outcomes improve when healthcare staff apply an empathic view onto patient care, it's a reasonable statement to make, and intuitively you may say, yeah, that feels right. That makes sense if staff have more empathy toward patients. A lack of empathy might result in a lack of patient satisfaction, and maybe it results in medical error. That's a theory. We can still try to understand why that would be, but that's a theory. But the point I'm making here is that if you're going to start to engage with something like the idea of empathy, how do you measure empathy? How do you see empathy? How do you describe it? What does it look like? Similarly, trust. What does trust look like? Even something like a feeling of autonomy, or a feeling of self-determination, or a realization, or a motivation. There are so many mechanisms that are happening sort of deeper in our psyche that get triggered in contexts. In conducive contexts, the right kind of mechanisms get triggered. There may be also negative type mechanisms like fear, trepidation, apprehension, hatred. These are also mechanisms because they serve to explain what we see at the empirical level. The empirical level might be the behavior of people. It might be at a systems level as well. So this is what we try to understand in the realist approach, that mechanisms underpin empirical reality. And this is an interesting point because so much of evaluation science is based on an evidence-based paradigm. An evidence-based paradigm would suggest that we should only take seriously that which is evidenceable, and leave the rest, leave the rest aside. After all, how can we conduct science on those aspects of our reality which we cannot easily measure or easily test? But the realist approach, what is brought to the table is the idea that we need to understand the mechanisms, even if they are not so easily evidenced. There's not super clarity on the mechanisms. And so here we get into theory. And a realist approach, the outputs of a realist approach may be a combination of evidence and theory together with the goal of pragmatic application. We want to test our theories pragmatically, even if we don't have the strongest evidence for some mechanisms. We put in practice the ideas and to see if results accrue. If we can solve problems through our hunches, our theories, along with the evidence, that is success. That is what a realist approach is trying to do. Okay, and so steps in the realist evaluation, say you're doing a realist evaluation, you're evaluating a program using realist principles. The first step is to establish realist evaluation questions. And I've put this word here, retroductive. Retroductive is a word that is used in realist research community of practice. Retroductive means explanatory. It means uncovering mechanisms, the activity of uncovering mechanisms. So your realist evaluation questions, basically, they should be framed in terms of how does the program work? In what way, in what circumstances? What are the contexts that enable the program? What are the contexts that impede the program? These are realist evaluation questions, and those questions are retroductive. Any question that gets to the mechanisms or the context mechanism interaction is retroductive. Step 2 is developing initial program theories for the intervention. So if you have an intervention you're studying, you want to examine the different components of the intervention. Maybe there's a training component, maybe there's a communication between service provider and service user, for example. So you want to break the intervention down into all its different parts and components and theorize using initial program theories. These are like your hypotheses, your initial hypotheses. Each one of those initial program theories should have an explanatory insight that you're trying to test. Even if it's a small, it could be the most minute little mechanism, a small mechanism, but a mechanism nonetheless. Every single one of your initial program theories should be explanatory. Then after this stage, you may establish protocols for data collection based on these initial program theories. And so these protocols might be having to do with the translation of initial program theories to the qualitative interview guide. If you're doing qualitative interviews, focus groups, maybe you'll do a survey, maybe you will even do a quantitative experimental design. And there's no reason why your initial program theories can't inform all of that work. So proceeding from initial program theories to protocol, you are designing the protocol to try to collect, with the attempt of collecting data that you'll be able to use to scrutinize against your program theories. In other words, you'll be testing your program theories through the data you collect. So then step 4 is collecting the data based on initial program theories. And then step 5 is analyzing. Now, this is where the CMO configuration may feature prominently in your analysis. So you might have interview transcripts. And so you're looking for causal insight in the interview transcript that can be explained through context, mechanism, outcome configurations. And so usually what I find in a realist analysis is that you have data extractions. So you've extracted data from your data set. If you're doing a realist synthesis, you're looking at literature, so primary studies in the literature. Same principle applies. You're extracting data from your data set, and then you are building CMO configurations adjacent to the data. So you might have multiple sources of data where you have multiple data segments that are placed one after the other. And the combination of these placements leads you to a sense-making CMO configuration that helps you make sense of this data, brings depth and a sort of a synthesis of the causal insight you're trying to understand. Step 6 then is presenting these outputs and dissemination. And so your dissemination outputs really should be around, this is how we expect the program to work for these people, for this location or for this time point or context. You're really showing what works for whom, under what circumstances, and how. That is your output. Okay. So just a few more slides. I want to show you the context mechanism outcome in a bit more detail. So this is a diagram that's from this article. The reference is there. You might think of context as elements in the backdrop environment of a program that have impact on outcomes. That's absolutely key, that the context has impact on outcomes. So demographics, could be legislative, it could be cultural norms. But the key is that these aspects are not part of the architecture of the program. It's not a formal part of the architecture of the program. It is the environment upon which the program is implemented, and more specifically, those aspects of the environment that have causal impact. Because of course, the environment is vast. There are so many elements to the environment. Not everything has causal impact that you see. So you want to pull out those that do. The mechanism, resources offered through a program, and the way people respond to those resources. So here is the specifics around the actual nuts and bolts of the program itself. This might include information, advice, trust, engagement, motivation. These are examples of elements in the mechanism, especially if you see these having, this is how the intervention works. If it works to offer motivation, it works to offer advice or trust, these are mechanisms. Then the outcomes may be intended or unintended effects based on the context mechanism interaction, which could be changed outlook, service uptake, decision-making, resiliency, health outcomes, self-efficacy, social connections, and so on. There are so many types of outcomes of interest, as well as unexpected outcomes. We're looking for all kinds of outcomes that can be traced back to the context mechanism interaction, right? The context mechanism interaction, what we're saying is context plus mechanism equals outcome. That is our causal equation, okay? So here is an example, okay? Here's an example of a CMO configuration. This is a hypothetical example. Just to get something more concrete, say you are an evaluator, a realist evaluator, and you're studying a school-based anti-racism intervention. And in the intervention, teaching staff, so the teachers, are offered a 12-hour sensitivity course to better understand, detect, and prevent racism in the school setting. So you might say you have outside trainers that come in, maybe they come from an organization where they have expertise in anti-racism education, and they work with the teachers. The teachers gain an awareness, clarity on what racism is and isn't, what is the boundary around racism, what is acceptable and not acceptable, and so on. So you might have an initial program theory that looks like this. Through the training program, teachers are offered information about what constitutes racism in the school environment, will recognize the signs of racism, and will confidently and frequently address racism in the classroom teaching. They will also report incidences of racism to their supervisors. This will lead to a reduction of racism in the school system over time and improve the learning environment for students. So your initial program theory is your attempt at being explanatory about the program. You may not be perfectly accurate to exactly what's going on because you're still at the periphery at the initial stage. You're still at the very start. You're doing your best to develop your hunch about how you think this program will work. So your idea is that recognition, this is a mechanism. Recognizing the signs of racism is a mechanism. Confidence is a mechanism. So there's two mechanisms already here. This is one mechanism. This is another mechanism for the teachers. And frequency of addressing. Now, this is an outcome because the outcome is the behavior. So you see that in the initial program theory, there's the context, mechanism, outcome elements, but you don't necessarily need to identify them because it might be too soon. During your analysis, during the actual stages of analysis, data immersion. This is where you can really sort out and clarify the C, the M, the O in your work. Now, if I expand this, the same intervention, and I give you an example of a context mechanism outcome configuration, I might start with this premise, okay? The context can be that schools located in different neighborhoods in the city will have difference in demographic composition. Some schools will have an ethnically diverse cohort of students, whereas others will be ethnically homogeneous. And these differences will impact on the functioning of anti-racism programming in various settings. Now, I haven't explained the depth of that, the detail of that, but you can sort of start to even get a hunch that those schools where it's all one ethnicity or race, there's no diversity, the anti-racism education is going to be received differently than in schools where there is a large number of different groups represented. So there's a lot of ethnic diversity. Interesting, right? This is context. This is clearly context. This is the backdrop and difference in the backdrop of programs. The mechanism, teachers are offered anti-racism training to better understand what constitutes racism in the school. So this is the mechanism, their improved understanding. As a result, better able to recognize and act when racism happens, mechanism. They will feel increased confidence in reporting such incidences to their supervisors. So this is all mechanism. There's multiple mechanisms in this statement, clustered. I've clustered multiple mechanisms. Better understandings, in other words, more clarity on what racism is, more ability to detect, that's another mechanism, more confidence in reporting, mechanism. This is explanatory. This explains the inner working of how it could work. Now, of course, there's no guarantee that it's going to work like this. In fact, it might completely backfire. We also have to contend to the idea that maybe the training will confront some teachers' own personally held views, which may be considered racist or have racist tendencies or stereotypes. And so that confronting aspect needs to be addressed. So this example here doesn't show all of the possibility of your theorizing, but it's a start, right? This is like a start. So already I'm starting to think about the context, mechanism, interaction. How will this program, how will teachers' clarity, confidence, recognition change in schools that have diversity versus schools that have homogeneity and so on? So the outcome could be variation in success of anti-racism efforts, dependent on the degree of racial diversity, even racial tensions in the local context. So you might have racial tensions that precipitate a anti-racism program, but how it plays out in relation to these realities of the context are what you need to explore. And so, I'm coming towards the end of my presentation. It's a very brief presentation. We have some time for questions, but you will find very quickly, if you do a realist project, one of the challenges is that when you're thinking of context, context can be so many different things. Context can be a specific event or a historical reality for a community. Or it can be something geographic, or it could be something demographic. There are so many ways to bring in context, and one of the challenges people find is to decide how to bring in context. That's when consulting with a team and working in a team-based approach, consulting stakeholders who are experts in the field, in the content area, they may also provide insights that can help you build your CMO configuration, your CMO analysis in your realist approach. So some concluding thoughts. So the complexity involved in understanding the context mechanism interaction can become quite deep and expansive. Just in the last example I'm just showing you, you can already think about how it can just start to really open up and become expansive. However, realist methodology is grounded in pragmatism and utility. So the CMO configuration is a heuristic, so it's a conceptual tool to arrive at an explanatory focus in the answer in the analysis to answer what works for whom, under what circumstances, and how. But ultimately, the outputs of a realist study can help to calibrate and improve the customization of intervention efforts to local contexts. And so the pragmatic aspect of the realist approach is what saves us from falling off into the deep end of complexity, because otherwise we can get lost in it. We have to find a way to sort of rein in that complexity and ask ourselves, okay, so what do we need to understand today? What is important for now in terms of improving the customization and the functioning of programs, and focus on an analysis of context mechanism interaction from that pragmatic point of view, knowing that you may not be testing everything, you may not be getting to the nth degree, on every single aspect, but you're working on something to help with the pragmatic aims. The idea is we must accumulate our evaluation science over time. We have a small realist evaluation that presents guidance. We implement programs in the future. We evaluate those programs. Does the guidance from a realist evaluation actually help facilitators improve the implementation of programs? And what's remaining? What remains for us to solve, to figure out? Are outcomes improving? And if not, why? And it's an ongoing effort. So there's a cumulative effort based on a pragmatic approach and narrowing the scope so that we don't get lost in the complexity once we start looking at context mechanism interaction. Okay, further reading, I've put some examples of books and articles on this slide for you to explore. If you haven't read anything about realist evaluation, my recommendation would be to start with the very first book, Pawson and Tilley's 1997 book, Realistic Evaluation. It's such a nice read. It's so clear, and it gives you the real foundations for their thinking. And then there are many other resources as well. So I will end my formal presentation now. I think we're at the 40-minute mark. Anne, I'll hand it over to you to manage questions, and I'm happy to have discussion, questions, debate. You may even engage in debate. Looking forward to the next section.
Thank you so much, Justin, for this wonderful and very clear presentation on the realist approach. I also wanted to mention that you just quoted the 1997 realistic evaluation, and I just wanted to mention that we're also very happy to have Ray Pawson as a member of a strategic advisory board at LIEP. So we're very interested in developing this type of approach. I have a series of questions, but I don't want to prevent anybody from asking theirs. So please don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat or raise your hand if you want to intervene. And otherwise, maybe I can start with a few.
Yes.
With a few comments and questions. I was really interested in how you situated generative explanation in relation to counterfactual and constructivist approaches. And I was wondering about the, in connection with this epistemological discussion, I was interested in the methodological implication of realist evaluation. So you, like, is there an affinity of realist evaluation with certain types of methods, or maybe mixed methods? You mentioned a diversity of possible methods, but of course there is this idea that in order to grasp mechanisms, the qualitative approaches can be more relevant, but then you said that it's not exclusive of more experimental methods. So maybe I would be interested in hearing you a bit more about the methodological implications in terms of choice of methods. And then I was also interested in the question that you raised a bit at the end of your presentation of stakeholder participation. since you tended to identify like dissemination as the last step of the research process, but then you mentioned that at other phases of the research process, it could be useful to involve stakeholders. So how and when do you involve stakeholders in this process? And notably, I was wondering around the formalization of the program theory. Like, is it only the researcher who does it, or is it something that's done in interaction with the stakeholders and policymakers, and like who defines the program theory that is going to get the basis of the whole analysis? And well, I have several others, but maybe
those are great
Thank
questions.
you so much again.
Yeah, those are great questions. And so let me start with the first one. It's a very interesting conversation and debate that's been had over the last number of years around the compatibility and incompatibility of the realist approach, both with positivistic paradigms as well as constructivist. And my take is that there is a compatibility with those paradigms. And to some extent, there is a compatibility, and we should harness and optimize that compatibility. And what I mean by that is that, with qualitative research, there is definitely a compatibility in the sense that qualitative methods can help us collect data that will be really closely aligned to understanding mechanisms, because we need to engage in our subjective thinking. Even the interviewees in qualitative research can be asked questions around mechanisms where they can try to share ideas. And that's what the whole idea of realist qualitative interview comes into play. So there's a natural affinity there. The difference maybe in between realists and constructivists is around causation. And there may be some constructivist types of research that are causally focused, but there's also some constructivist research that doesn't prioritize causation. They prioritize description, thick description, ethnography, and so on. And so what we may do is borrow from those traditions, but still have a commitment to causal understanding, even if that causal understanding is not necessarily easily evidenceable. So that's on the constructivist side. On the positivist side, realists will reject the idea that counterfactual causation is synonymous with realist causation. Realist causation is generative. In other words, we accept that there is deep underlying mechanisms that produce the manifested reality that we're seeing, and that is what is causation for us. Whereas counterfactual positivistic design, control, and experiment, for example, or pre-post tests, causation is defined differently. It's a successionist view of causation. This is where realists oppose the conflation, I would say, the conflation of positivism and realism. But at the same time, there's a compatibility as well, because some of the outputs of counterfactual work can still inform CMO configuration. So you might have outcomes from counterfactual design which inform the outcome of the CMO, but the the mechanism is still discovered qualitatively. So, you might have a quantitative outcome, you might have a qualitative mechanism. So mixed methods, as you said, and mixed methods is acceptable. So it's a bit of a nuanced discussion to have about the compatibility and incompatibility, but I think it's interesting, very, very interesting. Just quickly going to your second question around stakeholders, and that's another great question. It's a very good idea, and people do this. They design research in which the initial program theory stage may be, say, a few months. Say you allocate 2 or 3 months to your initial program theory stage. During that time, you set up a stakeholder advisory group. You meet with them, say, early, and you establish some general kind of discussions around the program. And then you go off and you develop initial program theories. Then in a second advisory group meeting, say after 3 months, before data collection, this is before data collection, you meet and say, these are our initial program theories. Do you agree? Do you think these are fair? What is missing from this list? How can we improve these? You have a day, a consensus event where you validate those initial program theories with a group of stakeholders. And that gives you some confidence that, yes, these are sort of, this is the right scope, this is the right articulation. Then you move forward with data collection. Now you might have the same advisory group at the end of your project or during your project, so during analysis, where you may consult them again and keep a dialogue going to make sure that you really are on track. There's one other element there that's very important, very interesting, is that your funders, the policymakers that are going to be your audience for your outputs, it's a really great idea to have them on board during the process so they can start to calibrate their thinking to the realist way of thinking. Because quite often policymakers are expecting this kind of binary research answer, like, yes, it works, no, it doesn't. So if they're not familiar with the realist approach and they receive realist outputs where the outputs say, well, it depends, and it will work better for this group, maybe not for that group, this may feel a bit uncomfortable for somebody who is used to this binary type of research output. So that is another reason why engaging stakeholders along the path is beneficial. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful discussion. So we have several questions in the chat. Is it fair to say that realist evaluation is not appropriate for evaluating a given program or a given commissioner? Rather, realist evaluation can be more usefully applied to evaluate a collection of changes in a given population which have been affected by a slew of interventions, including but not restricted to the commissioner's program. Yes, good question.
Yeah.
How do you find the evaluant?
Yeah, the answer is it can be both. There is nothing preventing you from conducting a realist evaluation on a very specific program, one site, one program, and maybe even the implementers are doing program monitoring using a realist lens. So you can be very specific, but like you say, you can also scale out and you can be studying a slew of programs, multiple programs, trying to understand a more cross-cutting view of the CMO configuration for the purposes of developing recommendations for policymakers. You get all that. And so in my work, working with clients, I see it all. I see everything. I see very broad bird's eye view type realist evaluations. I also see very, very specific, very focused. And so the way you design this and the way you articulate program theories will change based on your scope, but the realist principles remain the same. Yeah.
That is fascinating, actually, because I was under the idea that evaluation was always focused on a given program, but it's very interesting also from a research practice point of view to see that this is also a possibility in evaluation.
You see that in realist synthesis. Realist synthesis often has a more abstract kind of next layer up because you're looking at multiple primary studies, and each one of those primary studies has a lot of heterogeneity in the architecture of the program being reported and being researched. So we have to find a way to analyze all of that while taking into account that heterogeneity. And so, like I say, yeah, different scope. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So another question is a realist question of what works for whom under what circumstances, and how do we need to include all those elements, or can we focus only on certain of them?
Yeah. No, you can focus in on certain elements. You might have a realist evaluation that is very much focused on comparing, how does the intervention work in this context versus that context. So in that case, it's really a context comparison. And alternatively, you might have an evaluation that's really trying to unearth the social architecture of a program, one-off program, and understanding very in deep way how the mechanisms work in a singular program. So it can vary. So there is always an angle that comes into play. It can be systematic. So we can do what works for whom under what circumstances, and we can try to cover all that. But the pragmatic objectives will also be at play to help you narrow it in and come in at a certain angle, because your stakeholders might say, you know, what's really important for us is to understand if this intervention is going to work in this town where there's high unemployment. We know it works well in the big cities, but we don't know if it works well here. So can we really try to? So in that specific project, the focus has now become very unique and specific, and that's acceptable. We have to use this. It's a pragmatic methodology, and we can customize the design of the approach to need.
Yeah. The context mechanism distinction raises some questions of frontiers and delimitations. So one question about our characteristics of an intervention part of context or mechanisms. And I also had a question actually in the same vein about people's reasoning, because in the first part of a presentation, you insisted on mechanisms being more on the program side, and then you mentioned that mechanisms also involved how people react to the intervention. So I wasn't sure about that.
Very, very good. And could you just repeat the question? I missed the question.
So the first one was, are the characteristics of the intervention part of the context or the mechanism?
That's a great question. And so I see it, and it leads on to the question you just asked there. There is some gray area and some confusion around what constitutes context and what constitutes mechanism. For example, in the example I gave in the slide around anti-bullying training, you might argue there are some teachers that are naturally going to be good at communicating anti-racism messaging to students, and there are some teachers who are not going to be that. Even they've all taken the same training. So the cohort of teachers have sat in the room where they all received exactly the same training, but they also bring their own assets to the program. So we may argue that their characteristics, their pre-existing predisposition, their characteristics will also have an impact. Some teachers might actually hold racist views. Some teachers might have worked previously in anti-racism activism. So this diversity in the implementers is going to make a difference, and you might think of that as context. But what's interesting is, like, Anne, your question around how people react, and this is part of the mechanism. So what we're saying here is that in an intervention, when people receive resources, when they receive a social resource, like, for example, in this case, a student says something that is a stereotypical, pejorative stereotype of an ethnic group, and the teacher communicates something to that student, that communication, that alert, communicate, that's a mechanism resource. And then the student may respond. They may respond with a feeling of embarrassment. They may respond with a feeling of gratitude, that thank you for explaining this. They may respond with a feeling of anger. How dare you? And so all of that reaction is what we're saying is this is part of the architecture of the program. We are situating people's thoughts and feelings front and center in the program's architecture to say this is how the program is working. How people react to resources is how the program works. It's a very humanizing idea. The mechanism, ironically or paradoxically, is very humanizing in the realist approach, because we're saying how people respond to resources is explaining the success or failure of programs. Does that help, Anne? Does that make
Absolutely
sense?
Yeah, that's the understanding I had, but it's interesting the way you phrase it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so don't hesitate if you want to intervene. Well, otherwise I had another question about, since I'm taking advantage of nobody else asking, but please don't hesitate to raise your hand or ask questions in the chat. I was wondering, since the analysis is so much indexed to context, to what extent can you aspire to generalization in a realist approach? Like, is there the same type of questioning about external validity or generalization as in other approaches, or is it always very context specific?
Yeah, it's another excellent question. And in the realist approach, we don't engage so much with the concept of generalizability. That's a positivistic concept. But what we do engage with is the idea of transferability or portability. The idea being, what aspects of this program, or can this program be transferred to another context where it can be, where it can have success? Or when we talk about transferability, we might say, which aspects of this program can be transferred to other contexts and then have new intervention architecture built around these transferable aspects. So generalizability is a concept that would imply that an intervention will work in diverse contexts in spite of those context differences. Whereas transferability is a concept that suggests that interventions need to be understood in their context, and we might assume that some aspects of interventions can be transferred or ported out to other contexts. So there's certainly an interest in that, but when we talk about scale up, a realist view of scale up is that we are going to assume that we need to understand differences in context and focus on those very, very seriously in order to understand success and failure of scale up efforts.
All right. Yes, thank you. And actually, following up on this discussion on transferability, we have an interesting question on comparison in the chat. So the question is, what do you think of using qualitative comparative analysis with qualitative data for a realist evaluation?
Yes, you can. And in fact, I am familiar with some people who are doing this kind of work, merging these methods and methodologies. So there is some room, there is some space there for this, because the realist approach is very methodological. It's not methods prescriptive. So the actual how you're doing it on a day-to-day basis, analyzing your work, you can bring in a number of different approaches to support that, provided that you're following basic principles of the realist approach, generative causation, the CMO configuration, and adhering to kind of the general definition of these constructs. I think you can carefully merge some of this additional work. But what you want to be careful not to do is to cram so many different methods or approaches into the process that it sort of becomes like noise in your head. You know, it's too much baggage going on. You need that kind of simplicity of the approach as well. I personally find just using the CMO configuration in relation to data analysis is adequate for me, but other people might benefit from, might find it beneficial to merge like qualitative case analysis, for example, with the realist approach.
Well, thank you so much. So we're reaching towards the end of our seminar. This was really enlightening and very clarifying for me, at least. And I hope it was for the rest of the public. Thank you so much, Justin, for the presentation and your answers and the discussion. This was really really stimulating and very clarifying on many key points of the realist approach. And so our next seminar will be on, it's a different date than usual. It'll be on a Monday on May 9th with Laura Peck on experimental evaluative design for program improvements. And so you're very welcome to attend. And so thank you very much, everybody. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, Justin.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Thanks, everyone. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.
Sciences Po.